Hi everyone, my name is Emmy and I'm an alcoholic. Philo, thank you so much for asking me to be of service. Oh, I'm getting so emotional. There's so many people here. I usually say a prayer right before I speak, and I was trying to do my prayer, but I didn't mute the computer, so I forgot my prayers in the middle of praying. And these are prayers that I've been doing for my entire sobriety, and I freaked out. I'm like, why am I forgetting my prayers? Why can't I remember them? Because I'm a little nervous. That's why. But I'm so grateful to be here. I'm so happy to be of service. My sobriety is September 3rd of 2007. I have a home group. I sponsor people in the program, and I have a sponsor. Her name is Georgia B. And I have an amazing sponsorship family. And these are all super important things that really keep me in the middle of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'd love to tell you that my entire journey, my entire 13 years have been amazing, but the reality is that they haven't. It never really is. Life has ups and downs, and we have life on life's terms. So I'll start with what it was like, what happened, what it's like now. First of all, Kenny's gone. I was going to thank him, but he's gone, and he touched on so many things that I could relate to. I'm from San Diego, and I was very involved in stuff that he was talking about. So I was like, I got so nostalgic just thinking of all that. And I see a lot of familiar faces. It's nice to see your beautiful faces. Okay. Like I said, I'm from San Diego, and I was born to teenage parents. My mom was 14 when she had me. My dad was 16. So you can imagine the kind of childhood that I had. It was crazy. It was wacky, and I wanted no part of it. I feel like I grew up at a very young age, and you always hear, alcoholics saying, I felt very uncomfortable in my own skin and as an alcoholic. And so, yeah, that was me. But also I was born a boy. So I had another layer of discomfort, another layer of like not feeling comfortable in your own skin. And that was my entire life. I just did not feel comfortable in my own skin. So my parents got into drugs heavily. They were always in and out of jails, detoxes, victory outreach, whatever. And so that was my life. And my grandmother stepped in to raise me. She gave me such love, unconditional love. She always let me be who I was. And she just gave me such love and stability. And that was something that I always wanted. So when I was 7 years old, on our way to school, my grandmother got arrested right across the street from my elementary school. And I learned that evening at 7 years old that my grandmother worked with a Mexican drug cartel. She was taken into custody, federal prison, and she was given a 25-year prison sentence. And that's where a lot of like terrible things that happened to me started happening, because that started a journey into being shuffled around from home to home. And I had that feeling of like, nobody loves me, nobody wants me, right? Why is it that my mom can't get sober? Why can't she stay out of jail? Why is it that my grandmother's in jail? Why am I going to my other grandparents' houses, to uncles' houses, to aunts' houses? I just felt so, nobody wanted me. And I was always like a lost puppy. I just wanted people to love me and give me love. And I never really had that growing up. I would watch the Brady Bunch on TV, and I just wish that was my family. I wish that I was Marsha Brady. I wish that I had a loving mom who cooked meals, who asked me about my homework, who took family trips together. I didn't have any of that. Shortly after my grandmother went to prison, my mom was on welfare, food stamps, shoplifting to support her heroin habit. Sometimes she would come out of the stores, sometimes she wouldn't. And you can only imagine the craziness. I knew at 7 years old what sex was. I had already been sexually active because abuse is part of my story. I knew everything. I feel like I grew up in one day, the moment my grandmother went to prison. And I was exposed to lots of things that a child should never be exposed to. I do want to share that everything I talk about is simply my experience. And I realized, I learned in the program that these are things that make me uniquely qualified to help somebody who's gone through a similar situation. That it's not everyone's experience, but that's my experience, and that's what I'm sharing today. I vowed to be very different than my parents. I didn't want to be anything like them. I wanted to be a good student. I wanted to fit in. I wanted to be successful in life, and I vowed that I would never drink, that I would never do drugs. And, I did pretty good until I got to high school. So, once I got to high school, I realized that I discovered other substances before alcohol. And I feel that, alcoholism manifests itself in so many different forms, for me at least. My alcoholism manifests in money, property, prestige, men. Like, those are just things that, That's my experience. So I realized that as soon as I took the first sip or the first hit or the first snort, or I got this attention, this validation from someone, it was like I could breathe. And you know, you hear that a lot in the rooms, and I can so relate to that. So I love when people share about that because that's exactly how I felt. I was always this very feminine kid, and you know, once I had some liquid courage in me, I felt like I was an extrovert. I felt like I had a voice. I found refuge in theater. Theater allowed me to be somebody else other than myself. So I was, you know, I was a good student. You know, I was a theater geek and I loved it. My plan was to graduate school, move far away from San Diego because San Diego was full of so many painful memories, and really immerse myself in theater. Well, God had a different plan because when I was 18 years old, by this time my grandmother had already come out of prison and I was living with her again. But she was old. She was very old, and my mother caught a case at the border. She was crossing a big amount of methamphetamines, and she was given a lengthy prison sentence. My sisters came to live with us, and my grandmother one day said, I can't do this. I can't do this. I'm too old. And so she said they're going to go into foster care. And there was no way that I was going to let that happen. I got a job at the local phone company in San Diego. I was working at the time it was called Pacific Bell. It's now AT&T. And I was started making pretty good money there. I went before the judge and I got custody of my sisters. So here I am putting my life on hold, you know, because I had been admitted to 3 universities. I was so excited because I was finally on my way to be successful. Then my mom catches this case and now I have to step in and clean up after her. So the shame that I felt towards who she was turned into resentment. And that her behavior always just fueled the fire. I felt like I was always picking up after her, and I really never respected her or saw her as a mother. I saw her like kind of like an older sister. She was only 14 years older than me. So I always saw her like the bad sheep of the family, and I treated her that way. I looked down on her. I thought she was the worst. And I just didn't want to have a relationship with my mom. I get so emotional talking about this. And I'll circle back on this. But yeah, you know, I stepped in to raise my sisters. I tried to give them a stable home, a loving home, and I did the best that I could with the tools that I had. But at 18 years old, I didn't really have any tools. My tools were to numb myself with drinking and using and self-destructive behaviors. And, you know, I'm a blackout drinker. I black out and I do things that I don't remember the next day. And thank God cell phones didn't have cameras back then, because I'd be very, very embarrassed today. You know, I'd wake up from blackouts. People would say, what happened? What's wrong with you? You know, people tell me that I have become this belligerent monster that likes to fight people. You know, my parents were also gangbang cholos, so I think that's where I get it from. You know, I always try to hide that from everyone that I ever knew. I just always wanted to be like my grandmother. My grandmother was so elegant and so well-mannered, and she carried herself so well. And here I have my parents who are more on the ghetto side. And, you know, I just wanted to be like my grandmother. I didn't want to be like my mom, my dad. But when I start drinking and I start using, I become my mom and my dad, like a thug in a cocktail dress. That's what I become. And here's the thing. You know, I grew up so embarrassed of my mom, but I realized that I'm so much like her. I am so much like her in so many ways. So I'm raising these 2 kids, a 12-year-old and 8-year-old, and it's so difficult. It's really hard, and they don't listen to me. And I try to crack the whip and try to be very strict, and they start getting into trouble. And I'm like, how do I deal with this? You know, my solution was to put my sister in juvenile hall for 2 weeks. It scared her. It did. And, you know, I think it had an impact in her life. It could have gone the other way. It really could have. So I kind of got lucky in that sense. I'm drinking, I'm using, I'm blacking out. I get arrested for the first time for disturbing the peace. I spend the night in jail. Then a few months later, I try to kill myself because life isn't going my way. And life is really embarrassing and it's hard. So I try to off myself. That's the kind of alcoholic that I am. It's kind of extreme. And then I got arrested the second time. I got a DUI in Mexico. I was hanging out with some drug dealers and I got very touchy-feely with one of them and he didn't like it. So, you know, they put an AK-47 to my head and said, you're done. But one of my friends stepped in, took me out of that room, and I ran. I got in my car and I crashed into a parked car and I got a DUI and I ended up in jail in Mexico. So that was not fun at all. They don't treat you very nice when you're a US citizen. They didn't let me call the consulate and I was in jail for 3 days before my family even knew where I was. They also don't feed you. So, you have to beg for food in there. After that, you think that'd be enough to get me sober. And you think that would be enough to let me realize that I had a problem. And the reality is that I felt that I was young and that these are things that young people go through. And what ended up happening is, I started taking trips to psych wards. That was my go-to. I started planning my trips to psych wards. I'm like, okay, I'm going to kill myself. And if I don't die, then I'm going to go, be on vacation, take a break from life, because raising kids is really difficult and I don't want to do it. But that's how my alcoholism really kicked in. I started numbing myself with lots of other substances, and I went downhill pretty damn fast. The last time that I tried to commit suicide, I bought a bottle of Tylenol, the big Costco size, and I drank it. I ended up at Kaiser, and my liver started shutting down. I was hospitalized for 7 days, and on the 7th day, the doctor said, "You know what? We're gonna let you out. It's fine. You're good. Try to, don't do any cocaine, don't drink, don't take Tylenol, whatever you do." So I'm packing my stuff and these 2 EMTs walk in and they come and they ask for me by name. And I said, "Yes, that's me." And they said, "Well, we're here to take you to Sharp Mesa Vista, the psych ward, because this was technically a suicide attempt." So there I go back to the psych ward. I think it was my 8th psych ward stay. And I walk in and I'm just feeling so little, so demoralized. And I was very lucky to see the doctor very soon when I got there, and he looked at my chart. He's like, "Oh, it looks like you're here again. And it seems to me that all of your problems are alcohol and drug related. I really want you to look around the room and really see what the people in here have serious mental problems. And I suspect that what you have is a disease called alcoholism." That's what he told me. And, I didn't think that I was an alcoholic. I thought that I was just having fun, and this is what young people do. To me, an alcoholic back then, I used to think that an alcoholic was, being homeless on the street with a brown bag, or that to me was the vision of it that I had of an alcoholic. And that was pretty high functioning. Except for when I black out, but I had a job that I hadn't lost, and, I carried myself a certain way. But at this point, I'm so tired of being tired. What do they say? You get sick and tired of being sick and tired. And he said, "I'm going to give you the number to San Diego Central's AA office." And I said, "Okay." He said, "Call them, find a meeting close to you." And I called them, and they sent me to this little Alano club around the corner from where I live. It's called the Live and Let Live Alano Club. And I walked in, and everyone looked so different than me. Everyone seemed like they were 100 years old. And I just thought, great, this is what my life has come to. I felt like it was social suicide, and I stayed for the meeting because I had nowhere to go. And I don't remember anything that was said at the meeting. I just heard like, wah, 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 wah. And after the meeting, I was like dashing through the door when some woman stopped me. She's like, "Hey, you're new. What are you doing after this?" I said, "Oh, I'm just going home." She said, "Well, why don't you come have coffee with us?" And I was like, okay. The people pleaser in me said, okay. I didn't really want to, but I was like, what else am I going to do? Go home and watch TV? So I went to have coffee with them, and they invited me to come to the meeting the next day, and I did. And then they invited me to have lunch, and they bought me lunch because I didn't have any money. And then they invited me to come to the next meeting, and then we went out for dinner, and then they invited me to go to the movies, and meeting dinner, like that started becoming a pattern in my life. And I started hearing little things in the program, and these were little things that I could identify with. The steps seemed so daunting, the traditions, no, thank you. But when people shared about their personal experiences and how they felt inside, that was something that I could relate to. So it was suggested that I get a sponsor. I got a sponsor, and I started doing the steps. And, life got good real fast. And when life gets good real fast for an alcoholic like me, I'm in a dangerous place because I start resting on my laurels. I feel like I can take it from here. Thank you very much. And that's exactly what happened. I was about 10 months sober, and I had moved in with this guy, just a friend, not a romantic thing, but I had moved in with this guy who had 9 years of sobriety. And he was dry. He wasn't really going to meetings. And on Memorial Day weekend of 2007, we decided that it would be a good idea to buy a bottle of rum. And we did. I remember we poured the glass, and I was so excited because I missed that warm feeling of alcohol. And as soon as I took that first sip, I felt like a light went out inside of me. It was like, kind of like when you blow out candles on a cake. It was just like, and that started my relapse. Memorial Day weekend of 2007, I'll never forget that. And this disease is freaking progressive. I've done the research. I started blacking out right away. I started doing really inappropriate things. I started fighting with people. I started getting kicked out of bars. I got LASIK in a blackout. Like, that's not normal. Lots of, all that pitiful, incomprehensible demoralization. My roommate started doing other stuff, and he kind of scared me because he was cleaning and vacuuming at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I said, oh my God, what are you doing? You have a problem. Let's get you into rehab. And he's like, well, if I go into rehab, you have to stop drinking. I said, I could do that easily. And I drove him to rehab. He was going to be gone for 30 days. And I started partying. I had no intention of getting sober. And he'd call and check in. He's like, are you going to meetings? I'm like, yeah, but I wasn't. And then when time was getting closer to him coming out, I said, okay, now I really have to get sober. And I couldn't do it. I really couldn't do it. I would get 2 days, relapse. Then I'd go to a meeting, and I'd be so embarrassed to announce myself as a newcomer, and I'd relapse. I'd get 3 days, and I'd relapse. And then I gave up. I'm like, you know what? I can't do it. And I'm not going to. So he came home. We sat down, we had dinner, and he asked me, how long have you been sober now? And I couldn't lie to him. I'm not the best liar, so I couldn't lie to him. And he said, you know what? This puts my sobriety in jeopardy. So I don't know how this is going to work out. I said, well, I can drink outside of the house and not inside the house. And he's like, all right, let's try that out. I can't believe he said that. Like, any healthy, normal person would have been like, heck no, that's not going to work. But he said that, he was fresh out of treatment. And that didn't last, because as soon as I started drinking outside of the house, I'd come back home belligerent in a blackout, wanting to fight him, wanting to break things, or getting into accidents. And he said, you know what? You have to move out. He was actually being very responsible and serious about his program at that time. So he said, you have to move out. And I begged and I pleaded and I said, please let me stay. I have nowhere to go. He said, well, there is one solution. There's always treatment. And I thought, treatment? Ugh, that's going to take away my personal free time. But, I had nowhere to go, so I called him. And I found the nicest place that my insurance would pay for. I found this beautiful place in Pasadena. It looked beautiful in pictures. It had bungalows. It had tennis court. It had a pool. It just looked so pretty online. And so I said, you know what? I'm going to go check it out first. Let's see how it is. And I'll be back. He's like, all right, good luck. My friend drove me to the rehab center in Pasadena. I gave them my insurance card. They showed me some brochures. They had me sign some papers. And I'm like, this is great. I love it. It's really cute. I'll be back on Monday. And they said, absolutely not. You just checked yourself in and you need to detox. So that's where they sent me, straight into detox. I had no idea that I wasn't going to come home that day. But I guess I voluntarily signed myself in. I think I was still pretty hungover from the night before. And my judgment was a little cloudy. But that's probably the best thing that happened to me. I wasn't really serious about sobriety or getting sober, but I said, well, this will get, the heat off my back. People will stop pressing me to get sober. I kind of saw it as a vacation. And I tried to make the most out of rehab. I made a lot of friends. I wasn't listening in groups or participating, but I was having a fun social life. And I met this woman, amazing woman. Her name is Patty. And she was about to be discharged. And she said, why don't you come stay with me after you get out of here and we'll do the outpatient program together. She lived in Toluca Lake. And I thought that would be a great idea. Let me extend my vacation. So after I got discharged, I went to live with Patty. And it was fun at first. I went maybe to like 1 or 2 meetings with her, and then I was like, oh, I don't want to go to meetings. I'm just gonna stay behind. You go to your meeting, have fun. And that turned into me not doing anything but sitting on her couch, watching TV and eating her food. Eventually, she got tired of that. And one day we got into a huge argument, and I said, you know what? Screw this. I have a home in San Diego. What am I doing in LA? I don't even know anyone here. I'll show you, Patty. I'm going to go drink. I was going to go drink at her. And I drove to this bar in Pasadena that I would drive by every morning when I went to outpatient. And I couldn't get out of the car. Something stopped me. And I said, well, it's probably better if I don't drive drunk, since I'm going to drive to San Diego after this. And maybe I should wait till I get to San Diego and drink. And that was my plan. I was driving on the 5 South, and this was in October of 2007, and there were fires happening in San Diego at the time, these big fires at Camp Pendleton. And I remember being stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic on the 5 South when I just looked over and I felt something very powerful. I would see these huge flames and the trees burning from a distance, and I literally had a burning bush moment on the 5 South at Camp Pendleton. Something changed. Something came into my life, and I honestly believe that that's where my higher power intervened. I went to a meeting the very next day. I got a sponsor and I started taking direction. I started doing the steps, and I got involved in San Diego feeling good right away. I was that newcomer that was so eager about going to conferences, and I had so much fun doing it. I did that for the first, few years of my sobriety, and somebody suggested that I go back to school. I started taking one class at night or on the weekend, and because I was still working at the phone company full time, and then I would go to class at night. My sisters had already moved out. And after a few years putting some time together, the counselor called me and said, hey, it's time for you to transfer. What are you going to do? And I had no idea. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I wanted to pursue acting. I felt like by this time I was such a mess, and I didn't know that I wanted to do that anymore. So I chose a career that sounded safe, and I got admitted to Cal Poly Pomona. And I'll backtrack a little bit. When I turned about a year and a half sober, I was going to a lot of meetings. I was very involved, and then I met this guy who turned into my higher power. And I was a year and a half sober, and he was 6 foot, big lips, hazel eyes, muscular, very masculine, very good looking, and he also had 90 days of sobriety. So I was like, perfect, and wow, that was definitely a learning experience, this relationship that I had. We dated for a long time, and when I got admitted to Cal Poly, he said, you can't go to Cal Poly. If you go to Cal Poly, I'm going to kill myself. And I believed him. There was no way that I was going to allow the man that I love to kill himself. So I called Cal Poly and I said, I just want to say that I'm not going to be coming in this quarter. Can I please come in next quarter? I figured I'd buy myself some time. And they said, I'm sorry, Mr. Leah, you are going to forfeit your admission. You're going to have to reapply again. But I was so sick, in such a sick headspace at the time in this toxic relationship, that I was willing to take the risk, and I did. And so I didn't go to college. I didn't go to college, and I stayed with him. And shortly after I made the decision to stay in San Diego, he relapsed. And I was like, you stupid, stupid fool. How did you not go to college, stay with this person in an abusive, toxic relationship? And I was like, you know what? I need to break up with him. And I need to apply to Cal Poly again. And I did. I applied and I got admitted again. Thank God. And I moved right away, and I left him behind. And, we did this little long distance dance, but in the end, it was a very toxic relationship, and I learned a lot. And now I know why you don't date newcomers, because you need to allow them their time to heal, their time to grow. When I was 90 days sober, I met this guy in San Diego. His name is Jim. And he was very attractive, very successful, and I wanted to date him. And he said, you know what? I can't date you because you're a newcomer, and you're going to change, and you're going to grow. And he did me a favor. God knows where I would have been today. And I didn't do that with my boyfriend. I was still fairly new, and I was like, let's give it a shot. It didn't work out. Spoiler alert, it never works out. So I went to college and I got very busy. By the time I got to college, I was already in my late 20s and I just wanted to get out of there. I was taking 18 units and then I take 3 units at the junior college. I just wanted to get out of there. So I was very busy and my program suffered a bit because I wasn't really going to meetings. I was always busy studying or doing homework. You know, the promises were coming true in my life, but I wasn't doing my own personal recovery. I was, school was my main goal. When I graduated college, I moved to Los Angeles. I got this internship at a fashion PR company and started getting my foot into the entertainment industry. And I wasn't very happy. You'd think I'd be happy that somebody that comes from where I come from, that got a college degree, that is now in Los Angeles pursuing a career that they wanted, would be happy. And I wasn't very happy. Well, it turns out I was bedeviled. You know, they talk about those bedevilments on page 52. I was prey to misery and depression, having trouble with myself, having trouble in my personal relationships. And I met this guy and he was in my apartment one day and he looked around, he saw some AA paraphernalia and he said, "Oh, are you sober?" I said, "I am." He said, "Oh, how much time do you have?" And at the time I had 6 years. And he said, "Well, where do you go to meetings? Because I've never seen you. I'm sober too." I was like, "Oh, great. I don't go to meetings." And he said, "Well, how's that working out for you?" And the reality is that it wasn't. So he's like, "I'm going to write down a few meetings that you can check out if you want to." And he wrote down Hollywood Young People's Meeting. He wrote down Thursday Night Ohio Street. He's like, "These are young people's meetings. They're so much fun. Just go check them out if you're feeling up for it. We can go together, blah, blah, blah." And I went to Hollywood Young People's Meeting. I walked in and everyone was so loving and so welcoming. And I started building a community there. And I remember what that fellowship was like that I once had in San Diego. I was dry for 2 years. It wasn't fun. This woman invited me to this women's meeting and I went with her. And I heard this speaker. Her name is Honey. And Honey had this calmness about her. She had this energy. She had this beautiful spirit. And she talked about emotional sobriety. And she talked about having a healthy relationship. And she talked about, shame. Shame was something that I could really identify with because when I transitioned, I was already sober. I was about a year sober when I transitioned. And, Kenny talked about this a bit in his share earlier. He talked about the phobias inside the rooms in our own community. And I felt that. I really felt that because of jokes that my friends had made and little comments, cynical comments that they've made. I didn't feel like I was in a safe space to be myself. So I kind of went to a sister fellowship to try to, be myself. And eventually it all worked out. I came back and my friends were very loving and kind and whatever. But so going to this women's meeting, I heard this woman and she talked about shame, and shame had been something that I'd been carrying my entire life, not just from my parents, but also of who I was, because I come from a very Mexican culture and it's kind of looked down when someone is either gay or trans or something other than what they think is normal. And so I had a lot of shame, and I talked about this with her after the meeting, and she said, "Why don't you give me a call tomorrow?" I said, "Well, will you sponsor me?" She's like, "Call me tomorrow, let's talk." And I called her the very next day, and she said, "Okay, Emmy, if you want me to sponsor you, you are going to go to 6 meetings a week. You're going to get 3 commitments at those meetings. You're going to memorize my phone number and call me every day. You're going to memorize central office's phone number and call them every day and thank them for being of service. And you're going to call 5 women a day." And I looked at my phone. I'm like, what an order. I can't go through with that. It seemed like a huge ask. But the reality is that I was in so much level of pain and discomfort that I was willing to do whatever she asked. And if she said jump, I'd ask how high. And I did that. I called her every day to check in. If she didn't answer, I'd leave her a voicemail. Otherwise, it didn't count. I called 5 women a day, and that was so uncomfortable. It was so uncomfortable to call 5 women a day or just to ask people for their numbers after meetings. That phone weighed 1,000 pounds. And I called central office every morning and thanked them for being of service until they told me to stop calling because I was tying up their lines. And, I did whatever she asked me to do. This woman not only took me through the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, she also took me through the 12 traditions. And that's something that no one had ever done. And I learned there about, applying the tradition to your personal life, to your work life, to your romantic life. And I did the best that I could. I love, tradition 1, knowing like the common welfare, because here's the thing. I never think about like well, what's best for the group? I'm selfish and self-centered to the core by default. I always think like, what's best for Emmy? And so here I got to really learn on how to be conscious of a group and not just of myself. For me, my favorite tradition is tradition 7, being self-supporting. And that's not just financially, being self-supporting emotionally, because it's something that I always struggled with. I always just wanted someone to love me. And if someone can just love me, I'd be happy. And I try to fill that love with so many things. And it was, that hole was always there. So I had to learn how to be emotionally self-supporting. And that came with a lot of practice. And it's still a work in progress because I still struggle with it. I'd love to say that I did it once and I was cured, but that's not the reality. I have to really seek love from within, and I have to have this connection with my higher power to find this source of love. Otherwise, it doesn't come on its own. I have to do the work to be emotionally self-supporting. And that's why it's my favorite tradition, because it hits home so hard. I got very involved in service after I started being very, after I came back to the program and I rebooted my sobriety, I got very involved in service because those 3 commitments that I had led into other commitments, and I got involved in LACIPA, the Los Angeles County of Young People in AA, and I came on as a merchandise chair for a conference they were hosting back in 2015, and then the next year I became co-chair, and the next year I became chair, and that just opened up a huge fellowship, because we in Young People's in AA travel all over the country to conferences, to 12-step conferences. There's so many recovery groups that I didn't even know existed, because I got sober kind of young. And so I always felt like, okay, well, I guess I'm just one of the youngest ones here, but I didn't know that there were other communities of teenagers, of young 20s, like in Alcoholics Anonymous. And here I was exposed to that, and I was able to be of service to that community for many years. We started bidding for this conference called WACIPA, the Western Area Conference of Young People in AA, and we would travel to Sacramento, we would bid for it. This conference had never been to Los Angeles. And I feel like I remember seeing that LACIPA had been bidding for this conference since 1997, and they just had never had it. So my personal goal was to get this conference to Los Angeles for the very first time. And we went to Sacramento and bid for it, and we didn't get it. And I was pissed. I was furious, because we had done so much work and we had done so much outreach. And don't you know the work that I've done? Like, LA needs this conference. We didn't get it. It went to Canada, Edmonton, Canada. So then, you prep the next year and you start doing the work, and you're resentful because you didn't get the conference, and why does Canada have it? Like, not a lot of people can go to Canada. It's going to be a very small, and I'm starting being so judgy about this conference. We went to Canada to bid, and we didn't get it. Oh, I was so furious, and I'm like, I'm dropping out. I'm stopping. I'm quitting. I have things to do in my life that are more important than bidding for a stupid conference. And I threw a little hissy fit in Canada. I even told the advisory board, I was like, I'm done. I'm not coming back next year. If LACIPA wants to continue bidding, cool, but I have other things that I need to focus on. And somehow, one way or another, guess who was back at elections in the next few months? Me. And I said, you know what? Let's just bid again and see what happens. And I had to really change my mindset and really start to think about doing the full work and how that builds unity in the community in our committee, and not just about seeing the end goal, not focus on the end goal. We just had to focus on, us doing the work of being of service to young people in AA, and stay out of the results. We do the work and we stay out of the results, right? We turn it over to God. And for some reason, I don't know what happened, that I got into that mind frame. I met someone in the rooms, and I got into a pretty serious relationship. And for the first time, because of all the work that I've done in these last few years and applying the traditions, I feel like it was the healthiest relationship I had ever been in. I respected him, in every sense of the way. And I felt that it was very mutual. After we moved in together, when we celebrate a year of our anniversary, we rented an apartment together and we moved. I moved to Studio City and I was so excited. I was very happy. I had a very good job and he had a job and we were both self-supporting. We adopted 2 dogs. It was perfect. It was ideal. And a month after we moved in together, we got into a little argument and I found out he had been cheating on me and he had relapsed. And I didn't really know. I had no idea that this had happened. And I felt like I reverted to that 7-year-old me where I'm abandoned, right? My stability is suddenly not there anymore. And I didn't like it. And I would cry and cry and cry. And I cried myself to sleep. And it was really horrible. But here's the thing. I knew that we don't drink, we don't use, and we don't kill ourselves no matter what. I had to tell myself that over and over and over and stay very connected. Thank God I was so connected to the program. Thank God. And now I understand why my old former sponsor had me call 5 women a day, because when shit hits the fan, it's so much easier to pick up the phone because you're in the habit of doing so. And I called everybody crying like, oh, my ass is falling up. Like, it's fine. You can't save your ass and your face at the same time, right? I don't have a problem today doing that, calling people and saying, hey, I need help. Hey, this is what I'm going through. I don't have any secrets with my friends. I'm very open and transparent about what I'm going through. The good, the bad, the ugly. And my experience has been in 13 years that everything passes. Feelings have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it always passes. And I've seen and I've had the experience that it always works itself out the way it's going to work out. So right before this huge breakup that shook me, we had gone to Idaho to bid for the conference. And we were awarded the conference in Idaho. So we were going to host in Los Angeles for the very first time in 2020, January of 2020. And I was so excited. We had elections and I got elected to be the chair of the conference. And that's when we rented our apartment. That's when my breakup happened and my life was falling apart. My personal life was falling apart, but my service life was so full because I was the chair. I had it. This position forced me to get out of bed. It forced me to go and run business meetings. It forced me to travel to outreach our conference. It forced me to put on events and just continue being of service. And, I had a committee of 40 people and it forced me to make the agenda and really run this. And, only God knows why God puts us in those positions. If I really needed that position because I was in a really dark place personally. Shortly after the breakup, my grandfather passed away. And that was very heavy. I was scheduled to speak at a conference in Arizona called ASCII. He died on July 3rd and I was scheduled to speak on July 5th. And I called my mom and I said, I'll cancel. I know like you need me. And she said, no, you get on that plane and you go be of service to the people of Alcoholics Anonymous who have always been there for you. And that's exactly what I did. I went to this conference and I spoke on the topic that I was supposed to speak on. And I was in a lot of pain, but I got through it with the help of my friends. We don't do anything alone. We have such a big community here in the program and we don't do anything alone. 3 months after my grandfather passed away, I lost my job. So 2019 was just a year of loss for me, but it was also a year of planning for the conference that was going to happen in January 2020. And we put on this amazing conference in January here in Los Angeles, downtown LA. Wacky Paw came to LA for the very first time. And we put on this amazing conference with 1,500 attendees. And just, for me, it was so like fulfilling to just see the lights come on in these young people's faces and see that sobriety can be fun and you can have fun and there is a solution. And just because you get sober doesn't mean it's over. We're not a glum lot, I got involved in H&I in 2017. H&I is a big part of my life. I started going to panels at Juvenile Hall and I'd go once a month and speak to these young girls that came from the backgrounds that I came from. And, I see them and I'm like, that should be me. That should be my sisters. That should be us. it's so hard sometimes to break that cycle. And just seeing their faces, and they're so young, they're 14, 15, and they've already been through so much. I know what they've been through. And I try to give them hope, and I try to, let them see that there is life after that, and there is a solution, and, that they're not alone. It's that I tried the best to do the attraction rather than promotion. I don't know if we make a difference in their lives. I feel like we do, for at least the hour that we're there. I also get to go to Linwood Correctional Facility. This is all pre-pandemic. I also got to go to Linwood Correctional Facility, and I speak to these women once a month. And, when I see their faces, I see my mom, because that's where my mom came from, and that's the life that my mom lived. And through the work that I've done in the program, the immense process, I'm able to have a relationship with my mother, something that I never, ever really felt that I wanted. And my mother came out of prison 6 years ago, and she's been clean and sober since then. And that's just a freaking miracle. I always thought that I was going to get a call that my mom was dead in an alley with a needle in her arm. And today I don't have to worry about that. She's one of my best friends, and I talk to her on a daily basis, and she's trying so hard to make up for lost time, and she's kicking ass. She really is. She shows up when I need her emotionally, and she knows I'm there for her too. And she told me one day, she's like, I just want to tell you one thing. You've always been my rock. And she let me know that she's sober because she saw that it worked in me. And I'm just like, thank you, God. This is all I ever wanted. I just wanted to be at peace knowing that my mom was going to be okay. Yeah, I'm so grateful for the relationships that I've gotten to mend in this program. And I'm so grateful for Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm in love with Alcoholics Anonymous. So whenever I'm asked to be of service, if Philo texts me and say, hey, can you speak? You say yes if you're able to. And that's just how I was taught. You say yes, and you show up and you do the work. And especially now, there's a lot of unknowns and uncertainty in my life. And it's so important for me to stay very connected in the program. In the pandemic, it really forced me to start my steps over again. I just felt like it would be a good idea, and just we're so resilient, right? Meetings stopped happening, and we got on Zoom, and it's been amazing. I actually love Zoom. I spoke at a meeting yesterday, and it was an in-person meeting, and it was so different. It was at a park, and it was socially distanced, but it was just like, oh my God, I forgot what this was like. Because I've gotten so used to Zoom. We've been doing it for a year now, and I actually love it. I love that I can hop on a Zoom and travel anywhere, right? So anyways, I'm so grateful to be of service today. I'm so grateful for the program, and thank you for being here. I hope I was able to help someone.